Hi, my name is Olivia and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be a reading vlog with a little bit of a twist. My past reading vlogs have been fairly laid back and I never outlined any goals or a specific number of books that I wanted to get through in a set time period. But that all changes today. Something tells me that I may come to regret this by the end of the video, but today I'm going to be attempting to read A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin over the next 24 hours. I own the mass market paperback edition, which is 806 pages, assuming that you're not including the appendix and all of the houses and characters at the very end. A little over 800 pages doesn't seem unreasonable for a 24-hour readathon or reading vlog, but I'm saying this now before I've even started the first page, so we'll see if that actually holds true throughout the video. If you're not familiar with this book, it's the first installment in A Song of Ice and Fire series, which was recently adapted into the HBO TV show. It's a fantasy that's set in the fictional world of Westeros, and it follows several ruling houses as they all vie for power over these lands. Martin is renowned for creating a very complex world and so many characters that they're difficult to keep track of. This likely contributed to me picking up the book 3 times in the past on separate occasions and DNFing it each and every time. The sheer size of the world and the host of characters that you're expected to keep track of is enormous, and it was very overwhelming as a first-time reader with little to no introduction to this series. There are maps and character descriptions and names at the beginning and end of this book, but it's a little bit tedious to be constantly flipping back and forth between the text that you're reading and all of these reference materials. It's been a few years since my most recent attempt to pick up this first book, and at that point I had made it about 40 to 45% of the way through the novel. I'm feeling much more confident on this 4th try to get through the book now that I've seen the HBO series. And I think that's going to be a contributing factor to me getting through this story and getting through it quickly on the time crunch that I've set for myself. I already have some base knowledge and an introduction to the world and some of the characters, as well as the magic and the fantasy elements of this world. Due to the sheer size of all of the books in the series, this being the shortest of them, I recognize that the TV show could never capture the level of detail that Martin was including in his books. With that in mind, I think I may be a little bit lost here and there along the way, but I'm hoping it'll be a much smoother read and I'll be able to get through it quickly. After a not so great conclusion to season 8 of the TV show, I'm excited to get back into this world and delve into the plot and the characters that Martin wrote. It's a little bit after 6 a.m. right now, and since I'm setting my own rules for this impromptu 24-hour readathon, I think I'm going to start it at 7 a.m. and then end it at 7 a.m. tomorrow. Due to the sheer size of this book, I want to make sure that I'm maximizing my reading time during the 24-hour period. So there are a few things that I want to get done first, and then I'll get started reading. It's 7:01, which means it's officially the start of my 24-hour readathon. I've got my coffee, I've got my book, and it's time to get to reading. I just finished the prologue, a whole 11 pages into the book, and we've already seen our first death. Nothing screams George R. R. Martin more than killing off a character before chapter 1 even gets underway. It's also really throwing me off that the White Walkers are referred to as the others in the text, as a capitalized O. I'm so used to the show just referring to them as the White Walkers that I didn't even recognize them initially when they were first introduced in the prologue. After I finally made the connection that the others were synonymous with the White Walkers, this was probably one of my favorite prologues that I've read of all time. It was so interesting and immediately drew me into the story, and now I'm eager to continue reading. Most books have that opening line or opening page that draw you into the story. For this book, it's definitely the prologue. I've been reading for about 45 minutes. I just finished my coffee, and I figured this was the perfect time for an update. Also, I'm sorry if you can hear my dog snoring in the background. She's decided to sleep right next to the camera. I just reached page 58. I'm not sure that I'll be able to keep up this pace for the entire duration of the readathon, but if I keep reading at a comparable rate, it'll take me roughly 800 minutes or 13.33 hours to finish the book. This isn't sounding too awful at the moment. It looks like I'll have a chance to get some sleep tonight, as well as run a few errands throughout the day today. But my reading may also slow down pretty considerably throughout the readathon, and it may drag out my reading for well over 13 hours. So I'm gonna try to keep that in mind as I plan out the rest of my day. Already, the enormous number of locations that have been introduced, whether they're towns, kingdoms, or different castles and monuments, is bordering on overwhelming, and it's getting tricky to keep track of everything and where all of the various characters are located at any given point. I can only imagine that this is going to get worse as the book continues, so I have a feeling that I'm going to get very well acquainted with the map at the beginning of the book. I have to admit though, this map is not my favorite. It's split up over 2 different pages, and I'm not really enjoying the layout. I understand why they opted to format it that way, but it's not particularly visually appealing, and it's also difficult having to jump back and forth between the 2 maps. To give you a bit of an idea about what I'm talking about, here are the maps in my edition of the book. As you can tell, it's divided up between the north and the south, and there's a little bit of overlap at the bottom of one map and the top of the other. I'm not enjoying having to skip from one map to the other, and I think I would have preferred one continuous sheet, even if that meant that there had to be some sort of fold-out coming out of the book. I've never had a great memory for made-up words and locations in fantasy worlds, especially when it comes to their geographic distribution and different features of the terrain. I figured this may pose a bit of a challenge before I even started this book, and so far it's proven to be true. I was originally planning to rely fairly heavily on Google searches to look up information about the various regions and cities that were being introduced in the text, but on second thought, I'm concerned that that may lead to a few spoiler-ridden searches that I won't be able to erase from my memory that will ruin either this book or some of the later installments in the series. To err on the side of caution, I'm going to be relying on a combination of the map at the beginning of the book and my own memory to draw on information that was previously revealed about locations. This might end disastrously, but there's only one way to find out. Who knows, I may break down and end up Googling a few things down the line. The constantly changing perspectives is also going to be a bit of an adjustment to get used to. Most of the books that I've been reading recently have had only 1 or 2 points of view, and this is several orders of magnitude greater than that. So far, it's been a little jarring, even as someone who's seen the TV show and has some familiarity with the characters. These first few chapters have been very info dump heavy, especially as it relates to the characters and their backgrounds, and some of the history about the realms and the constant fighting for the throne. While I'm intrigued by the historical commentary on Westeros, its rulers, and some of the fighting that's taken place, I'm hoping that future chapters will be able to integrate it into more plot-driven scenes. As a predominantly plot-driven reader, I love the action and high-adventure scenes, and we haven't gotten to see too many of those so far. To be fair though, it is fairly early in the book to see some of these more action-driven scenes. Also, on a completely unrelated side note, I was shocked by some of the character ages in the books, and they differed pretty considerably from how the characters were portrayed in the TV series. John, for example, is only 14 at the beginning of this first book, and in the show, Kit Harington never looks like a 14-year-old. Not that I was complaining. I can understand why the HBO series elected to go for somewhat older protagonists, especially when it came to the children, but I can't help but feeling a bit lied to. The TV show set me up to not expect actual children to be present as some of the main characters of the books, and that came as a bit of a surprise once I had started reading. Okay, with that fairly random tangent out of the way, I think it's time that I get back into reading. It's currently 8:20, and I just arrived at the very shocking realization at how many characters are still living in the books. I had forgotten about so many of the people that make appearances in this first book, and I'm not sure whether to blame George R.R. Martin or the HBO show for this. I think Martin gets a kick out of killing off characters left and right, and the more emotional the death, the better in his eyes. Even from the prologue, you get a pretty good indication that there's going to be a fair number of deaths, and they're not all going to be pleasant to read about. So at least he's honest up front with readers and what they should expect for the rest of the series. Rightly or wrongly, I also haven't been able to stop myself from comparing the characters that Martin has crafted to how they're portrayed on the TV series. It's incredibly interesting to see how true some of the actors are to the character descriptions that Martin provides in the book. At the same time, I can't help but question the number of creative liberties that were taken with some of these portrayals for the HBO show. There's such a vast discrepancy between the characters that are spot on and those that are very, very different from the description that Martin wrote. Physical appearances and mannerisms aside, I think that watching the show before reading the books was very beneficial for me personally, because it provided me with some background information about family lineages, histories, and backgrounds that you don't come across right away in the book. Martin weaves all of these details throughout the narrative, and they're not necessarily presented in a chronological order. So you somewhat have to stitch the information together and connect it to what you already know about those characters. I think that's one of the features that makes this book so intimidating and tricky to get started with initially, but it's also one of the more noteworthy components of the books. I think my prior failed attempts to reading A Game of Thrones were due, at least partially, to feeling overwhelmed by the incessant gush of history, trivia, facts, and characters that Martin flings at you right from the first page of the book. While this was a pretty prominent negative for me in the past, it's actually emerging as one of my favorite aspects of Martin's writing style in this fourth attempt to get through the first book. Not many writers can pull off world building to the scale and magnitude that Martin manages to do so, and even fewer writers can do so well. I'm not sure if my newfound appreciation for the complexities of the book with respect to the world building, the characters, and even the geography is a reflection of having more exposure to fantasy books and series, or whether it's a product of being more familiar with this world in particular after watching the entire TV show. As if these books weren't complicated enough as is, Martin utilizes each chapter break to switch back and forth between different points of view. While doing this, Martin does an excellent job of distinguishing between the various characters' voices, which is something that's very challenging, and I commend him for it, because he juggles quite a few perspectives throughout this first book, and I've heard that even more perspectives are introduced later on in the series. The chapters that are narrated by some of the children, particularly the Stark children, actually sound like they're told from the vantage point of a child. Martin does this very, very well, and he's avoided all of the pitfalls that I've found fault with in the past. I'm also intrigued by the architecture and building methods that have been introduced so far. While I've only read about a tiny fraction of the world, there's already been a number of unique and very creative architectural designs and engineering feats that have been described. Winterfell, for example, is noted as being built on hot springs, and the hot water actually runs through the walls of the castle, heating it. Even though this has no real bearing on the actual story and is just a method for me to get even more sidetracked, I'm curious to see whether there's going to be any explanation for how some of these structures were built and the technologies that were used to do so. Have they invented some novel building techniques that don't exist in the modern world? Is there some type of magic involved? Right now, we don't really have any answers to these types of questions, and I have a feeling we're just barely scratching the surface with respect to the unique architectural components of the book. I have a feeling that none of these components are actually going to be addressed because I can't foresee them having any real bearing in the plot and the story overall. But it was still something that piqued my curiosity. So far, the plot has done a great job of drawing me in and prompting me to continue reading. So I think I'm going to get back to the book, and I'll update you again shortly. It's 9:15 and it looks like I have not moved from this spot all day. Something tells me I'm going to be updating in a lot of the same spots throughout the readathon, so please bear with me with that. I just reached page 160 and I was in between chapters, so I figured it would be a great time to stop and give an update. So far, I'm really appreciating Martin's ability to infuse some humor into his dialogue and narrative, especially during some of the heavier scenes. This was something that was often overlooked, undercut, or even excluded altogether from the TV series, and I wish it was something that we'd seen a bit more. I've gotten a kick out of quite a few of the one-liners, and they definitely help to lighten up the mood a bit and change the tone of some of the darker scenes. Also, the constantly changing perspectives are starting to grow on me as I get further and further through the book. I have to admit, I was a little skeptical initially, and they can be very disorienting for someone that's very new to the series. But now I'm finding that they provide some unique insights into characters' backgrounds, perspectives, thoughts, opinions that we wouldn't otherwise be getting if it was told from one point of view. It's also interesting the sheer number of internal dialogues and opinions that characters keep to themselves, and how those didn't translate well onto screens for the TV show. A lot of these emotions and inner turmoils and debates were never adequately portrayed on the show, and I definitely feel like I was missing something without having picked up the books. As a result, the books are providing much more depth to the characters. You get to see some of their inner dialogues and their internal debates and struggles. And you also get an idea of the emotional impact that some of the transpiring events are having. Sansa in particular is written very differently from what I would have expected based on the first few seasons of the HBO show. The book has helped to add some dimension to her character and show how naive she is in the early stages of the series. Knowing where she ended up in the TV series, it looks like Martin is setting her up for some considerable character development and some very well-written character arcs, and I'm looking forward to those. I'm not sure whether these character differences are a reflection of Martin's phenomenal writing style, or a certain shallowness to the TV show, where they weren't able to adequately convey everything in the allotted amount of time for each episode. Martin's ability to craft characters who are incredibly flawed and make decisions that are controversial and morally gray is one of the most interesting aspects of the book so far. This approach to creating characters lends the series to not having any true clear-cut villains or protagonists. While there are a few individuals who are undeniably outsiders to this, most of the characters fall somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, never truly reaching the status of a hero or a villain. When characters fall somewhere into this middle ground, readers are more readily able to rationalize their decisions and sympathize with what's happening around them. Despite the fact that this opens up the characters to begin to meld together and become just one indiscernible character and personality, Martin is able to steer each of these individuals away from each other and in very, very different directions. Each character is given an original and well fleshed out backstory, and their upbringing often helps readers understand why they're making certain decisions down the line in the books. With the sheer number of characters that Martin introduces into these books, it's very admirable that he's able to create all of these different histories for each individual, and he's able to define their voices so that they're so distinct from one another. Of the characters that I've met so far, I'm morbidly fascinated with the Lannisters, and I'm not afraid to admit it. Based on the TV show alone, Cersei and Joffrey are some of my favorite, not so admirable characters that you can't help but root for at some points along the way. And I have a feeling that this is going to hold true throughout all of Martin's books. I'm not sure if any chapters in the series are written from either of their perspectives, but I would immediately drop everything and read an entire book or series from either of their points of view. I think it would be fascinating to see the world through their eyes, especially Cersei's. So I'm hoping that she narrates a few of the chapters down the road. Arya is another of my favorites at the moment, although I will concede that she has a little growing up to do, and I haven't seen as much of her as I would have liked in this first book. She's definitely taken a bit of a backseat and hasn't been particularly involved in much of the action so far, but I'm looking forward to seeing more of her as the story progresses and her character arc starts to be more well-defined. The pacing of the book has slowed a bit in these past several chapters, but I think their primary purpose is to provide some backgrounds. I don't want to lose momentum during this readathon, so I think I'm going to get back into the book, and I'll come back with another update soon. I finally reached the 25% mark in the book. It's 10:30 a.m., and right now I'm at page 215. The portion of the book that I've read since my last update has given me an even better appreciation for the sheer size and complexity of the world and the expansive characters that Martin has decided to take on. I didn't realize it at the time, but the beginning of the book held your hand a little bit as you went through it. It was set primarily in Winterfell, so all one location, and you didn't have to keep track of too many different characters off doing different things at different times. And it gave you a bit of backstory with each character that was introduced. Martin walked you through some of the important family lineages, some of the houses and their histories, and some of the relationships between the characters that you're getting to interact with. At that point, there also wasn't an incredible amount of action, so you could focus more on understanding the basics and the mechanics of his world and his writing style. Now, I'm at the point where a character will be referenced briefly in passing, with minimal context. They won't be mentioned for another 100 pages, and then they'll show up in the narrative. And Martin expects you to remember what had seemed like trivial details, 100 pages or so, in some insignificant dialogue. This setup is making it blatantly clear how intentional Martin is with his writing. Nothing is truly trivial or able to be overlooked without sacrificing some knowledge or understanding later on in the book. All of the information that's been uncovered builds on your pre-existing knowledge base, such that if you begin to forget things and fall behind, it's very, very difficult to catch back up and get a grasp on some of the new historical facts that have been revealed, as well as the lineages, the house relationships, and some of the political tensions. I always have trouble remembering character names, even outside of the Game of Thrones series. I went into this book optimistic that I wouldn't have to reference any character lists because I had been introduced to a lot of the major players in the TV series. But I finally resigned myself to looking up a non-spoilery family tree on Google. All of the side characters were becoming a bit tough to juggle all at the same time, especially the ones that we haven't spent much time with. So I'm hoping that the family tree will help to reorient me in the scenes featuring characters that I had long since forgotten about. I'll post a link to the family tree that I'm using down in the description below for anyone else who might be interested. When I was searching for the family tree, I used that as an opportunity to go off on another tangent and try to figure out the exact number of characters in the series, as well as the number of those characters that die. While I wasn't able to find any exact figures, both numbers were astronomically high. And I can't say I'm complaining about the number of deaths in the series. I believe it was J.K. Rowling who once stated that a good writer knows how to kill off characters, and Martin certainly knows how to kill a character or two. Disappointingly, there haven't been very many deaths so far, and it's been about 50 or so pages since the last one. So I'm thinking it's about time for another death to pop up here and there. The deaths certainly help to keep the narrative interesting, and they also reflect a time and a society that are very different from our own. The apparently very logical solution of killing one's foes, competing to the death in tournaments, and executing criminals accentuates and propagates the war-driven mindset of many of the rulers and inhabitants within Westeros. It adds additional depth to Martin's world building and also helps to explain the very violent history that follows many of the royal families that are discussed. Many of the characters have become so desensitized to death and murder that they just view it as another Tuesday, which speaks to the commonality of these practices and helps to cast the majority of these characters in the morally gray light that I had mentioned before. On a completely unrelated note, I also can't stop wondering how the seasons work in Westeros. There are references to individuals tracking and comparing the length of each day, and then using that information to determine when summer is coming to an end. But I'm intrigued as to the science that's behind those methods and what caused them to originally be developed, as well as what actually prompts the seasons to change. The extreme variability in the length of each season is one of the unknowns that I've spent way too much energy and time thinking about. I would love for the specifics of the seasonality in Westeros to be explained further down the line, but like the architecture, I have a feeling I'm going to be disappointed. I'm somewhat doubtful that it'll be addressed, but I guess it never hurts to hope. And with that, I'm going to get right back into reading. It's 11:45 right now, and I just reached page 270. I've spent the past 20 pages or so focusing on how naive some of these characters are, and I keep returning to that concept throughout the book, especially when I'm constantly comparing them to the TV series. One of the most obvious examples of this that I've stumbled across so far while reading was Robb's very botched speech to Tyrion and the Night's Watch when he's filling in as the Lord of Winterfell. In this day and age, it's mind-boggling to me that anyone would let a 14-year-old rule any type of castle or household. I can see how this type of setup in a society might lend itself to having adolescents grow up much, much faster and gain some real-world experience, but you can definitely see that Robb isn't ready to rule quite yet, and he's making some pretty rash decisions because of it. He's pretty much thrown all diplomacy out the window at this point, and I don't picture this ending well. Jon and Bran have proven themselves equally immature, and they're much more emotional and quick to anger than I was originally expecting them to be. While the circumstances that they've been thrown into have certainly warranted some hard feelings and emotions, I wasn't expecting it to this extent, and it's definitely filtering their view of the world and really impacting the decisions that they're making. And those might not be the wisest options that are available to them. The HBO show, by comparison, really seemed to catapult the children into adulthood pretty much immediately from its outset. So the differences between the adaptation and the book series are still a bit disorienting and discombobulating. This leads the characters to feel a bit foreign, but I'm hoping that sensation will go away as I become more and more accustomed to how Martin is representing them in the books. I'm intrigued to see if immaturity in some of these younger characters is going to continue throughout the series, and at what point it's going to diminish or vanish altogether. And I'm curious to find out at what point they actually reach the maturity level of the actors who portrayed them in the show. I've admitted it in the past, and I'll admit it again. I'm usually not a huge fan of reading about young children or even reading from their perspective, due to the immaturity and the naivety that a lot of them display. Their narratives in books are usually filled with whining, complaining, and acting as some sort of a hindrance to the other characters that are portrayed. And I find that I quickly run out of patience when reading about this over and over and over again for 200 or 300 pages. That hasn't been the case so far with A Game of Thrones, and I'm very, very thankful for that. This could have been a much more painful read if the children had fallen into more of the stereotypes that I've seen in a lot of recently published works. I'm also very optimistic that readers are going to get the chance to see them grow up and gradually transition into adulthood, which I think will be an interesting ride, and I can't wait to see where it ends for some of these characters. On the topic of characters, I still haven't encountered any more deaths since my last update, and I'm starting to get a little concerned. This either means that George R.R. Martin has lost his flair and is getting a little lax with his gut-wrenching and heartbreaking character deaths, or that he has something devious and utterly devastating planned for an upcoming chapter. I'm not entirely sure which of these options I prefer, but at the moment I'm leaning toward an unforeseen catastrophic event to spice things up a little bit and throw things into turmoil. I also just stumbled across a pretty revealing commentary on women's roles that's given by one of the patriarchal figures in the book. And this is one of the primary reasons that I wanted to stop reading and come on here to give a quick update. During a conversation with Arya, Ned Stark references that at some point in the future, she's going to marry a lord, oversee his household, and have children. And that's framed as the extent of what she's going to achieve during her adult life. I'm assuming that these ideologies are reflective of the time period during which the book is set, as well as the world in which these events are unfolding. Arya rightfully pushes back during this discussion, vocalizing her refusal to assume this sort of life. And it's one of the reasons why individuals like Arya, Cersei, and Brienne of Tarth stand out as personal favorites when it comes to the characters in this series. George R.R. Martin takes this traditional and very highly overdone fantasy trope and turns it on its head by creating these strong female characters who are able to hold their own against their male counterparts, and even assume positions and responsibilities that would typically be held by a man. Nevertheless, the dialogue provides some interesting insights into the roles of women throughout Westeros and how this varies based upon ages, backgrounds, and geographic location. It's definitely going to be something that I'll be keeping an eye on as I continue further in the series, and I'm curious to see how this is going to change as we're introduced to more and more characters with different upbringings. I think someone wants to go outside, so I'm gonna go walk my dogs and grab some lunch. I've been reading for about 5.5 hours, so I think it's time for a bit of a break. Right now it's about 2:30 and I just reached page 360 in A Game of Thrones. Immediately after lunch, I took a bit of a break from reading to FaceTime a few friends and start editing a video that I want to go up later this week. But I'm still determined to finish A Game of Thrones in 24 hours, so I made sure to keep my break short and quickly got back into reading. It's only 2:30 right now, so I'm still feeling pretty optimistic that I'll be able to finish this within the next 17 hours or so. I'm also quickly approaching the halfway mark, which is oddly motivating in its own right. I don't want to jinx myself, especially this early on in the readathon, but I have a pretty good feeling that I'm going to be able to finish this one and complete my goal of reading all of A Game of Thrones. With respect to the book itself, I'm quickly coming to realize how graphic the narrative actually is. I wasn't sure if the gory details portrayed in the TV series were for dramatic effect and the visual appeal that would draw audiences in, but the TV show was fairly true to the books in this respect. There are plenty of gory details to go around. For example, as someone who's grown up riding and working around horses, it was unsettling to read some of the Dothraki scenes where it seems like they're always butchering a horse, and it's described in a little too much detail for my liking. On a different note, the political tensions are starting to mount, and it's highlighting how much Martin has capitalized on some of the strained relationships and histories between the houses. Although, to be fair, if everyone got along, there wouldn't be enough content for a single book, let alone a series of books that are all approaching or over 1,000 pages. The ways in which all of the characters interact due to these various house ties and tensions causes me to frequently pause and try to consider the political ramifications of certain actions before they can actually play out in the story. Martin seems to enjoy picking out very obscure consequences for some of these actions and decisions, and then they play out to have major ramifications for later plot points. While I've had a blast trying to predict what some of these consequences are going to be in the future, I haven't had much luck so far. Martin is definitely doing a great job of keeping me on my toes and taking the story in a completely different direction than what I had been expecting. His ability to show the deterioration of relationships between different characters is also unparalleled. The plot of this first book focuses a lot of time and attention to how much individuals can change and grow apart over a series of years or decades, which is something that isn't well portrayed or is merely glossed over in a lot of other written works. I've also found it interesting that Martin makes this such a focal point in the book, and I'm curious to see if this is going to hold true for the rest of the series, or if it's merely to draw readers in at the very beginning and then transition to different plot points that aren't so character-focused. I'm also very surprised that it took 320 pages for the first mention of "A Lannister always pays his debts." This phrase popped up quite a few times on the TV show, and I think it was very prevalent early on, maybe the first few episodes of season 1. And I was starting to wonder if it was something else the TV show had lied to me about, or if it was actually included in Martin's books. It definitely doesn't appear to be as prevalent of a mantra as the HBO series would have you think, so I'm curious to see how frequently it's going to be brought up in future chapters and even later books in the series. Before I get sidetracked on too many random thoughts and tangents, I think I'm going to wrap up this update and get back into reading. It's 4:15 and I just passed the halfway point in the book. I'm currently on page 424. So far, I've been amazed by how many plot points, details, and characters either weren't included in the TV series or I have since completely forgotten about. I started watching the show in 2014, and I haven't rewatched season 1 since, so it's definitely possible that I've forgotten a few things or erased them from my memory along the way. From what I've heard, it seems like the first season from the HBO series correlates to the first book in Martin's series, and it's fairly true to Martin's narrative, his plot points, and the characters that he introduces. And if I'm remembering correctly, as the seasons progress, they start to get further and further away from Martin's books, up until the last several seasons where they've actually surpassed Martin's writing of the books. I wanted to be able to compare the movie series to its TV adaptation, so I'm planning to rewatch season 1 after I finish up with this first book and maybe continue on watching a season for each book that I read. I'm excited to refresh my memory for the TV show, and I'm curious to see what characters, events, facts, and even historical information was deemed important enough to be included in the film versus what was tossed aside. On a little bit of a different note, these last few chapters have focused on the justice system in Westeros, and I found that really fascinating to read about. It's one of the first glimpses that we see into how the Seven Kingdoms are ruled and what measures are in place when some of those laws are broken or there's a dispute between two individuals. The trial by combat described in this first book provides a very interesting combination of religion, politics, and fighting prowess. It appears that there's either one or two universal religions throughout Westeros, but neither has been described in much depth so far. I'm wondering if the specifics of individuals' religious beliefs are going to come to light somewhere in the narrative, or if Martin's merely going to continue with these vague, nondescript references to old gods and new gods without filling in readers as to what beliefs stand behind those. This book is also making me blatantly aware of my complete lack of knowledge of medieval weapons and armor. I've had to look up an embarrassing number of words, which has led me down a Wikipedia wormhole on more than one occasion. I can say with certainty, though, that I now know much more about armor and the names of its individual components than I ever cared to. I'm not sure whether I characterize this as a positive, but who knows when that kind of knowledge might come in handy. I'm hoping that I'll have to look up fewer and fewer words as I continue to progress through the series, but I guess I'll just have to find out. And with that being said, I'm going to get back into the book. I just reached page 552 and it's 6:45 right now. Sansa has just reached an entirely new level of obnoxious, to the point that I'm starting to dread reading from her perspective. While I was initially fairly indifferent about her character, I'm now leaning much more toward hatred. It may be too early in the book for me to definitively say that, and I'm well aware that later books in the series may sway my opinion, but at the moment, she's nothing short of whiny and annoying. Over a surprisingly short period of time, she's become incredibly short-sighted and selfish, pitching a fit whenever things don't go exactly her way. If I didn't know any better, I would have assumed that Arya was the older sister of the pair, based purely on the Stark children's temperaments and behavior. I've lost most, if not all, of my pity and respect for Sansa at this point, despite everything that she's been through. I'm not sure whether Martin intended to shift readers' viewpoints of Sansa, but if so, it's incredibly well executed and well disguised within the narrative. As an author, he's brilliant at keeping his cards close and refraining from revealing exactly who the readers should be supporting and vying for. There's no clear-cut protagonist, which makes this novel really unique, especially for a fantasy. With the narration switching between so many different perspectives, readers really have their pick of characters that they want to stand behind. I'm surprised by how drastically my interpretation of the characters and their various motivations has differed from watching the TV show and now picking up the book. It definitely helps to read from their point of view and learn their exact thoughts, emotions, and opinions as events are unfolding, because many of these aren't necessarily vocalized in front of others, and there would have been no real way to introduce them on the show. It's also amazing how quickly Martin can convert readers from loving a character one second to hating them the next, and vice versa. He's done this multiple times already, above and beyond just with Sansa, and I'm sure it's something that will continue through the rest of the series. I haven't seen most of these coming, which makes them even more startling, and it renders this a very unique aspect of Martin's writing style that I haven't seen replicated in many other authors. It certainly makes for a few interesting twists and turns, and on occasion it's completely upended my predictions for where the book is headed plot-wise. I love how Martin has included this as a prevalent component of the narrative because it really keeps readers on their toes and second-guessing various characters' alliances and motivations. I have a little over 12 hours left for the readathon and about a third of the book left to tackle. I wasn't expecting to be this far through the book halfway through the readathon, which is definitely reassuring, and it's looking promising that I'll be able to finish the entire book within 24 hours. I'm starting to get a bit hungry, so I think I'm going to switch over to the audiobook and cook some dinner. I'll make sure to check in again after I eat. It's 8:15, and since my last update, I've finished up with dinner and made some progress listening to the audiobook. I just got to page 607, and Sansa is growing more and more intolerable as the book progresses. While this typically would be a downside for me as a reader, I have an appreciation for the very wide variety of characters that Martin's trying to introduce and portray. This book is one of the rare occasions in which the children actually act their age and have a correspondingly appropriate level of maturity, which is one of the reasons that I have so much respect for Martin as a writer. For whatever reason, this seems particularly difficult to harness in many other novels, and it's usually not done well. Sansa's thoughts, emotions, and rash, impulsive decisions would be expected of an 11-year-old who's thrown headfirst into these circumstances. And it's one of the more subtle and understated components of Martin's writing style, but he manages to weave it in throughout the narrative, and it's evident in many, if not all, of the younger characters. I think it's going to be very, very tricky moving forward as the series continues to unfold to pick favorites as well as most hated characters, because Martin adeptly portrays many of the characters' strengths, weaknesses, flaws, and shortcomings. While readers may not agree with a specific character's actions or decisions, Martin falls back upon the individual's backgrounds and life experiences in an attempt to explain or at least rationalize some of these choices, regardless of how controversial they are. This helps to add another dimension and humanistic component to many of these characters. You get to see some of their great decisions alongside some of their poorer ones, their best times and their worst times, and you get to see their reactions to each of these events and experiences. I've also just gotten my first glimpse of a democracy-like form of government within Westeros. Associating this type of governance with the barbarically represented clansmen sends a very prominent message about how democracy is viewed as a weakness and somewhat of a rudimentary form of governing and leading a group of people, particularly within this fictional world. It provides an interesting commentary with respect to some of the benefits and the downsides of embracing something like democracy as a form of governance. And it seems to be at odds with the establishment of seemingly superior monarchies throughout many of the more established and developed regions of Westeros. One of the other things that's been standing out to me recently is how little of a role Dany's actually playing in this first book. Relative to the other characters, it seems like we haven't spent much time with her. For most of the book, her subplot has taken a bit of a backseat in favor of some of the ruling at King's Landing and in Winterfell. Dany's very far removed, geographically, from many of these events that have transpired so far, so we don't even get to see Dany's character or the Dothraki through a different individual's perspective. All information that we've gotten so far has come from Dany herself, and it's been very few and far between. Unless my memory has completely started to fail me, I, for some reason, was thinking that she had quite a bit of screen time in the TV series, especially relative to some of her co-stars. If this is actually the case, I'm curious as to why the producers decided to use her subplot as a focal point for the TV show, when it clearly wasn't as big of a focal point in this first book of Martin's series. Now that I've said this though, the last 200 pages will probably end up making a liar out of me and focus very heavily on Dany. It looks like there's going to be only one way to find out, so I'm going to get back into reading. It's a little after 10 o'clock, and I just reached page 694, and nothing is going to plan or remotely closely to how I predicted it. Tension has been building since the very first page of the prologue, and I have a feeling it's going to culminate in something huge and completely unexpected, even as someone who's seen the first season of the TV show. I'm a little bit worried because there are a number of unanswered questions, and while the suspense is killing me, I'm not exactly sure how he's going to be able to wrap up all of these loose ends in the last 100 pages. I wasn't expecting this headed into the book, but Martin's use of the flip-flopping, constantly changing points of views really capitalizes on your emotions. As soon as one character that you might remotely care about is in some kind of peril or predicament, Martin then chooses to ignore them for the next 7 or 8 chapters. You'll hear no mention of them, and you won't read any more from their perspective. And then maybe 50 to 100 pages down the line, you'll finally figure out what happened to them after that major plot event. While frustrating, this is one of the primary things that captivated me as a reader and drew me into the plot, constantly keeping me on my toes and making me not want to put this one down. Even though the HBO show gave me a little bit of background for how the story's going to tie up, I have a few characters that I'm very, very nervous for, and I'm really excited to return to their perspectives to see how things unfold in Martin's book. With that being said, I think I'm going to fly through the next 100 pages pretty quickly, so I'll update you either along the way or as soon as I'm finished with that. It's 12:15 a.m. and I just finished a Game of Thrones. That means that I successfully completed this readathon, reading the entire book within a 24-hour period. It took me about 18 hours in total to finish up the book, switching back and forth between the audiobook and the physical copy. This novel was a 5-star read for me, hands down, and it was a wild ride immediately from page 1. I can confidently say that it's one of the best fantasy books that I've read in a long time, and I know for a fact that this one will be making my favorite books of 2019. I'm exhausted right now, so I think I'm going to update you in the morning with some more complete and coherent thoughts once I'm a little bit more awake. It's the next morning, and I wanted to take a little bit of time to wrap up the vlog with a few final thoughts now that I've finished the book and have had some time to ruminate on it. I'm absolutely ecstatic that I was able to read a Game of Thrones in its entirety within a 24-hour period, and I even had a little bit of time left over at the very end of the readathon. I was trying not to set my expectations too high at the start of the readathon, and I wasn't sure how quickly I was actually going to be able to get through the work. I'm a very quantitatively oriented person, so during the readathon, I created a few graphs and data to try to pick up on some trends that may be useful for me in future readathons. Above and beyond my somewhat sporadic updates throughout the readathon, I took the time to record my current page number every hour on the hour. This resulted in a not so exciting line graph with fairly even progress throughout the readathon. So I decided to go back and calculate how many pages I had read within each hour. This proved to be much more beneficial, and I can even see a few trends with only one readathon's worth of data. As you can see, I started off very strong, reading a little bit over 70 pages for the first 2 hours of the readathon. I'm a morning person, so this didn't come as a surprise to me. I was going into this expecting the morning to be my most productive reading period, and my reading to sort of decline gradually as the day wore on. My reading speed plummeted much more quickly though, reaching an all-time low around 1 p.m. To be fair though, I did decide to take a little bit of a break around lunchtime in order to do some non-reading related things, so this may have contributed to the 18 pages that I read between 12 p.m. and 1 p.m. Interestingly, my reading peaked again around 7 p.m., which usually isn't a particularly productive time of day for me. My reading speed then proceeded to fall again as I was listening to the audiobook while I was cooking and eating dinner. I did manage to redeem myself a little bit at the very end of the readathon, and I think the mounting suspense within the book contributed to my reading revival. Moving on from the statistics, I love reading about politics, particularly in fantasy series, and George R.R. Martin certainly delivers in that respect. The complexity of the court politics and the various relationships between the different houses was one of my favorite components of this first book, and they helped to set A Song of Ice and Fire apart from many other fantasy series, which fall very short of my expectations in this realm. Martin is a genius in his ability to tie together all of these historical details, relationships, family ties, and different character stories and subplots, all into one cohesive narrative. In doing so, he doesn't sacrifice the plot or the world building, both of which still play very important roles in a Game of Thrones. And these are two aspects that I always try to look at critically while I'm reading. Consequently, Martin's attention to detail was something that really stood out as a positive in my eyes, and it contributed to the realistic feel of this series and a lot of the characters. He was able to juggle so many points of views and storylines simultaneously, and the way in which he did so made it seem effortless and seamless. Once I got accustomed to the constantly changing perspectives, it was no longer very jarring as you switched from one part of Westeros to a completely different part of it, making this one of the major draws to the story. Having already watched the TV series in its entirety, I was able to pick up on quite a few hints and foreshadowing regarding where future books in the series were headed. I definitely would not have noticed all of these clues and revealed pieces of information that actually had significance if I hadn't had some previous exposure to the world itself, as well as some of the plot lines and characters. With that being said, I'm sure that there's plenty of details that I did not pick up on. They probably went right over my head. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's going to be very interesting to come back and reread this series after my first time through it. I never thought I would say this, but I'm glad that I went into this series with a little bit of background knowledge. It gave me a much better understanding of the geographic locations within this world, as well as a lot of the character dynamics and relationships. Overall, this was a very strong introductory book to a series, and I'm hoping that Martin can keep this momentum going throughout the remaining books. I'm very glad that I picked this one up, and I can't wait to continue on with the series. I'm planning to pick up A Clash of Kings sometime within August, and I'm planning to do another 24-hour readathon and vlog it along the way. Let me know in the comments down below who some of your favorite characters are, whether you've watched the TV show, read the books, or some combination of the two. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.